Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Halloween episode of Bookish, a casual book club. I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed colleagues and English professors, Laura Yu and Dr. Kofi Adisa. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hey.
So
We don't
today
have
we're
to be
talking
so formal.
about today we're talking about spooky stories or scary stories, and we thought this might be a fun episode given that we're recording in October, and we were talking about your like favorite kind of or an interesting scary story that you've read recently or that you wanted to read, and so um, we've each come prepared with our own little story of sorts. I think Laura, you tried to read a novel, but I mean, a
Oh
tad
yeah,
bit
it didn't work.
ambitious for that. So let's start with a question that I think Laura, you asked that you thought would be a really interesting kind of way to frame our conversation, um, and that is, what is scary? Like, what is scary to you? Because I think each one of us chose maybe something slightly different, and according to our different definitions of scary. So I chose one that had to do with like an actual little monster in my story. But there are some other ones where it's like Laura, you were saying, like it's a dystopian setting, and that's scary, or a political reality that could be scary for different reasons. So what are the stories that you guys chose? Let's get into it.
So
Laura.
I actually, I actually was going to read because I've been wanting to read Shirley Jackson's "We Have Always Lived in the Castle," and like I've had this book for a long time on my shelf, and I guess it's a short novel, and yet I could not finish it. I couldn't. I just didn't get it done, and it's not anything about like the book being good or bad. So at the last minute, I did Google some like short stories, like horror short stories, and I was very surprised to actually find such a wide range of topics that are covered. And if there are tons and tons of lists of like best top 10 horror short stories or novels or whatever. But so I settled on reading something by Stephen King called Survivor Type. Um, and then added a really really short story by Ray Bradbury called The October Game, and they are
Hmm.
both stories that are, I guess, horrifying because of the horrible human behavior. So Survivor Type by Stephen King is about this guy who gets stranded on an island, and long story short, actually short story short, because it's not a long story, he basically eats himself to death, I suppose, right? At the end. And you're kind of, it's in the first person, and you kind of are witnessing this horrifying, um, a person basically breaking down, falling apart, and what a person is able to resort to thinking that this is how he's going to survive. So it was horrifying, but I wouldn't have guessed that kind of story to be counted as horror. Like when I think of horror, I think of, I don't know, ghosts and monsters and maybe more gore. Um, and the other story, Ray Bradbury story, is like a little bit more like Shirley Jackson, kind of like the lottery kind of a story, where it's a very short story. It takes place on a Halloween day, and this father of a family ends up committing a horrible, I don't know, crime against his daughter, little daughter, and it's horrifying in that way, right? So both of these stories have to do with the horrible ways that the horror that humans are capable of. Maybe, I don't know, and maybe that's why it's scary. Like people are scary, you know what I mean? And the older I get, I do feel that way, that people are scary. Yeah, so but generally I can't do like ghost stories. They scare me. I can't watch ghost movies. um But I did listen to the Survivor type on audiobook as well as reading it. And that was interesting to hear sort of the, how the actor reading the book, reading the short story represents that person, that character. It was horrible.
Was it horrible that the actor was reading it, or was it horrible that the story was horrible?
Sorry, I guess I shouldn't say horrible. I should say horrifying. I guess, yeah, that's a better word form. Yeah, it was horrifying.
Yeah. The interesting thing is I kind of took a totally different track. I went to the classics. I went to The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which, because we're in Maryland, it seems apropos. And it's one of those stories that continues to resonate because it's kind of about madness and an obsession and a violent crime all rolled up into this really short story. And then I also read A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. Again, it's one of those stories that, when you're in high school or maybe even your first year in college or a lit class, you're tasked to read this story, and it never gets old, but it's always mysterious. Why would she be in the bed with a corpse? And again, I think it speaks to a kind of madness that Faulkner was dealing with in terms of the South and the decay and the death of Southern ideas that Emily may have embodied. And then I ended with something a colleague of ours mentioned, One Happy Hour. His name is Lamont Bond. Shouts out to him. And it's A Day of Absence by this poet named Douglas Turner Ward. I had to make sure I get the name right. And it's about a place in the South where suddenly all the Black people disappear. And again, the people are reduced to a kind of madness, especially the mayor. And he tries this appeal towards the end to get the Black people to return, because they don't know how they disappeared. They don't even know why they disappeared. They just know they're gone. And so in all three, there's this, this sinking into madness and this obsession with something. And when it came to Poe, his character was obsessed with that, what he called the evil eye or the vulture eye of the old man that ends up being killed and decapitated. Sorry if I'm spoiling it for those of you who've never read Edgar. Sorry if that's really blowing your tops right now. And then, of course, with A Rose for Emily, it's so interwoven with the history of Emily's family. And you have this town talking about her as well as talking about her history. And so it's both of them all three are just interesting stories. Now, are they scary? No. Is there levels of suspense? Yes. And I think they speak to a particular time period in which, there was a stronger American reading public that may have found these stories haunting, and, with the play, it's much more of a lampoon of 60s culture, especially in the civil rights movement. But it is also, this sort of sinking into madness. And I think that in a lot of horror stories, especially those like with Stephen King and many others, madness becomes the most horrific thing because it's something that gradually occurs and it never seems to stop. And so, yeah. And you, Sylvia?
So I think I might have read one of the more traditional types of scary stories where there's like a monster involved, but it does, now that you mention it, Kofi and Laura, like there is an element of like, it's really about humanity and like madness and, how people behave or like lose all sense of reason and civility. And, some of that is in order to survive, which, kind of happened in this story that I read, but also you have to keep your wits about you as well in order to survive. So I read this story that I assigned to my creative writing students called Free Jim's Mind by Tananarive Due. And I actually first came upon this story via a podcast, LeVar Burton Reads. I don't know if you guys know that podcast. I love it because it's literally just LeVar Burton reading like various stories. And much like from my childhood days of reading Rainbow, his taste in literature remains chef's kiss. Like he is still impeccable in his selection and his curation. And he's just such a great reader. I just love listening to him read. So I first heard him read this story like a couple years ago, and I was like, oh, I have to share this with my students. And his podcast, because in his podcast, like at the end of the story, he ends it with this like maniacal laugh that's purely LeVar Burton. He just goes, and that to me is like the best type of like, campy horror story. But Tananarive Due, I gotta hand it to her. Like the woman can write. This story, when you first read it, basically the synopsis is about a pregnant slave who's running away with her Native American husband. And when you first read it, you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to, read another this type of story. And, it's kind of been done. But the horror element to it is really interesting in that they go to seek refuge with her uncle, Jim, whose nickname is Free Jim, because he famously convinced, his owner at the time to give him his freedom, basically. And they never thought that would happen. And so they suspected that Jim had done something, I don't know, magical or maybe supernatural. He had a bag of mojo, right, that he was famous for, and they think that it was this mojo that he used to convince and basically cast a spell in order to buy his freedom. But he became very wealthy, and he owned a mine, hence for the title of the story. And really, the story takes place in the span of one evening, and they ask Free Jim for refuge for the evening so that they can hide out from the slave catchers who are trying to, capture them, and they're pursuing them right now. And that in and of itself, I think, is the horror too. And so it's like horror, different types of horror layered upon each other, but they go and they hide out in this mine, which has basically become semi-flooded from all the rain that's happening. And over the course of that evening, let's just say not everybody emerges from the mine either alive or in one piece. I'll just put it at that. I'm not like Kofi. I'm not going to give you all a spoiler alert, okay? But the way it ends is just so like succinct, and like it's just how a perfect ghost story should end. Do you know what I mean? Where like there's a little hint but no explanation. It relies on the reader to kind of piece some of these things together. It won't fully answer it for you, but it's really interesting. So I read that, and there is a monster involved, but it does actually, now that you guys are mentioning, have to do with these questions like, what are you willing to barter? Are you willing to even barter your soul, right, for freedom, for what? And so it's really interesting what each of those three characters, Lottie, who's the protagonist, the narrator, her uncle Jim, and her husband William, it's interesting to see what they're willing to sacrifice in order to get what they want, and what they're not willing to sacrifice as well. So I really enjoyed that. But I will tell you, the very first story that ever scared me, I remember reading like R.L. Stine. I don't know if you guys read those types of stories too, but the real story that first scared me was Edgar Allan Poe. Someone got me his like short stories, or maybe I bought it when I was like, middle school maybe. And I remember I read the Mask of the Red Death for the first time.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It was like late. Yeah, it was like late at night in my bed, and I was freaked out by it. And then when COVID came back around, I was like, it's real, it's happening, like the idea that like the plague can be embodied in like this evil person that's following you around. I'm realizing that like stories that have to do with pursuit really freaked me out. Like, I don't know if you all saw that episode of Lovecraft Country where the little girl is being chased around by those two.
Oh yeah.
The twins.
Oh my God, that gave me nightmares for a week straight. I was screaming. I could not. I cannot stand chasing things, like things chasing me, or even a slow pursuit. Somehow the slow pursuit is even scarier. But as I was reading this, I was curious, like, what was the last story
like
or thing that you read?
Halloween.
Yeah, basically, trick or treaters. That's my worst nightmare. What was the last story or thing that you read or watched that really like genuinely scared you, and why? I guess my question.
I would say, if you don't mind me going first, there is one book and one movie I will never watch again, and that is The Exorcist. Um, that is the one. I know there's been adaptations of the movie. There's been like somewhat remakes of the movie, but I remember being a kid, and my mom used to love reading those types of books, like a lot of Stephen King's books. I can't think of the author of The Exorcist, but she really loved reading those types of books, and I just happened to. It came on television. It was that. This was in the '70s, so I'm a bit older, and they would have these TV movies that would scare the life out of me. And The Exorcist was one of those movies. It was supposedly edited for television, but the vomit scene, the head turning, I mean, it terrified me. And it still terrifies me. Years ago, when I was not being a teacher, but I was somewhere else, and I was in an office, and it was late at night, and they had maybe the 25th anniversary of the movie or something like that. And I call myself being brave because this time the internet was fairly new, and they had the trailer with the Linda Blair possessed face. And I accidentally hit the mouse and it scrolled over the face. And then this voice said, "I am no one." And I freaked out. I'm the only one in the office, and I hear this voice blaring from the speakers. And so, yeah, that's one I would never read and I would never watch again. You couldn't pay me to watch it.
I can tell you, I can't remember the last thing I read that scared me because I don't put myself in that situation because I don't like to be scared. But I do think, in terms of movies, I do feel like the first thing that I thought of was I think I was genuinely scared by the Blair Witch Project, the movie. Because it's like one of those things everybody went to see it, so of course I had to go see it. And it was really, really scary. But other than that, I really can't think of, being scared watching movies or reading something because I don't enjoy those. But certainly in preparing for this episode, I have been thinking a lot about these questions about like what is considered horror and what scares us. And so far from our conversation, I'm getting the sense that, because you're right, Sylvia, even the stories that are seemingly about the ghost or the monster, ultimately it's about the humanity, the human behavior in that, right? And I think that it seems to me what really scares us is like the human mind that begins to fall apart and becomes uncontrollable and unhinged, and like it can no longer be managed or reasoned with. And I think I see that sort of being a thread in a lot of these stories, when it's like whether it's our own mind or the mind of others that we can't predict, we can't rely on to be sound, right? And I think that's really seems to be the source of feeling scared, maybe.
So then, like, why do you guys think we do this to ourselves? Like, why as a society, like literature, I mean, it's a whole genre, right? Like horror, scary story, even dystopian, speculative fiction. It's like a whole thing. And it's really popular. A lot of people gravitate towards it, you know? So why do you guys think we do this? Like, why do we write these scary stories? Why do we go to these places that are truly frightening about like what we're capable of, or monsters chasing us? Like, I mean, some people, I guess, find it to be fun. Like you, Laura, I'm not one of those people, but I'm just so curious. Like, why do we do this to ourselves? I wonder. What do you guys think?
I did read something real quick before, and it talked about a little bit about the power of catharsis, and because what the horror genre does is scare, startle, shock, and even repulse. And actually, the repulse part I wouldn't have guessed, but I think that's very true. So there's something cathartic about experiencing it, outside of ourselves, I guess, as we watch it or read it. Yeah, that's I don't know.
So like safety
I wonder.
in scary stories, almost.
Yeah, I also
Go
wonder
ahead,
if
Kofi.
there's just. Yeah, I wonder if there's this sort of latent religious morality behind some of it, that we want to know that good can triumph over evil. And so when you have stories like the Telltale Heart, the guy goes mad in front of the authorities, and you hope that the authorities arrest him for the crime he has done. But then you have stories where that doesn't happen, and it leaves us to wonder if good and evil are simultaneously on the same road, and that when they cross over, maybe evil wins. I mean, how many Halloweens have there been? I thought Michael Myers was mortal, but apparently
Yeah.
he's not. And so
He's immortal, apparently.
yeah, it's just like zombie movies, right? So when you were talking about when they made the remake with the zombies that ran real fast, that made it sort of kooky scary, like, because you would think rigor mortis would seep in at one point, but the idea, but the idea of the slow lurching zombie, and that there's so many of them, no matter how far you run, they can catch up with you. And that's the thing that it sort of feels like there's this, I guess it's catharsis. I guess it's this moral feeling that there's always something lurking either behind us or near us that we're going to have to confront in our good selves. And sometimes I guess it just really doesn't matter. I think a lot of the stories that have come out, at least within the 20th century, have some connection to war in some say, or the disembodiment of the body being destroyed. And so it plays on certain fears. There was this book called Night Flight. I think that's the name of the book. And me and my sister were reading it because my mom had it, and it was about this guy who could leave his body at night and just go about doing different things. And then and I'm sorry, I'm going to ruin somebody's day by telling them the end of the story, but his body they think he's dead, and so he can't get back into his body. And so that's the horror. Like you have this ability to get out of your body, do certain things, but what happens when you don't have access to it again? So, I mean, there's so many reasons why I think people write horror stories or write stories that are scary. But I think there's some either moral reason. If you think about the German stories, Hansel and Gretel, they disobeyed and they get eaten by a witch or something like that. There's all this sort of moralism behind, I think, some of these stories, and that we just want to, we want the good to win. and we want the evil to lose, but sometimes it just doesn't happen.
Yes.
That was very theoretical.
No, but it's so true though, the idea of like the moral element to them, you know, like in a lot of fables or fairy tales that have a really scary kind of, you know, origin or horror origin or, you know, tone to it in terms of like scared straight, like keeping people on, you know, the straight and narrow, you know, don't disobey or this will happen, you know, you better not mess with the supernatural because then the supernatural will mess with you, you know, and so, you know, that's a shout out to your exorcist, right? Like don't mess with the order of things, or
Yes.
things can go horribly, horribly wrong. And then there are just, I find that like a lot of stories, like the one you mentioned, the Night Flight story, I just find a lot of horror and scary stories to be also wildly imaginative in a way that, you know, like regular stories might be more confined and constrained. And maybe it's an element too of like that id kind of being let loose a little bit in these scary stories when humans can really follow their truest, maybe, you know, basest kind of nature. And that's a form of just being able to do whatever the heck you want, even if it destroys the whole world. You know, like a colleague of ours used to say, like, I don't get zombie stories because why would they eat their only food source? At some point, they're going to run out. And you know, I was like, I think that's the point, though. I think like it makes no sense. You'll just destroy yourself. Like that's Stephen King's story. You're just going to end up eating yourself. You know, it doesn't make a difference at that point. And there is something to that, you know, letting your id fly free, I guess. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in. And we hope that you have a truly scary Halloween and a read and you enjoy that. If you do read any of the stories we mentioned, or if you have any scary stories that you enjoy, please drop us a comment. You can find us under Bookish, a Casual Book Club on YouTube, on Facebook. And you can also catch our podcast on Bookish, a casualbookclub.podbean.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Till next time, see you later.
Happy Halloween.
Bye.